joining us on the Wednesday class that shall not be named. We're here with an amazing group of people, as always, on YouTube. Welcome to Arlene and Ron and Lou and Michael and Noel and David, Eva and Jeff, possibly Karen and Paul in there. David, where are you right now again?
I'm in London right now.
We got somebody, we're
I have
international
a question,
still.
David. Which is your home base? Is it London or here?
It has been London. I've been in the process of transitioning to Savannah for some time, which was slowed down a bit by the fact that my son has been sort of rooted here. But the plan is at some point soon, I'll be based exclusively in Savannah.
Oh,
We're looking forward to it, although it's nice to be international. We got, again, two states at least, Georgia and South Carolina. We got two other countries, Texas and Britain. So we're doing well. And that doesn't
Noel,
include.
have you been hit with bad weather, Noel?
Yeah, no, how's it going down there for that? How's the weather down there?
Noel, how's the weather in where you are in Texas?
You must not be able to hear.
Lost her for a second, or maybe she is not able to hear. She may not be able to hear. Can you hear us, Noel? Raise your hand if you can hear us. I think she's still looking. There we go. Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and begin. As we decided last week to choose a very interesting topic, and that is non-Jews who have had a great positive effect on the Jewish world, although it's kind of a large title. So I looked throughout history and got a few names. Since we were going to go out and, on a timeline here, but since we have David here all the way from England in London, why don't we start with the man who may have had the greatest impact on Jews in the 20th century. And again, who we're going to talk about here are not necessarily people who even like Jews. We're talking about people who had the biggest effect on the Jewish community. And you cannot go to this place without talking about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill may be the greatest man of the 20th century for all of his faults. And certainly his relationship with the Jewish community was very good compared to others, but not perfect. And yet just his ability to keep England alive and out of the throngs of the forces of Germany during World War II probably saved the Jewish community, or probably all the Jews in Europe would have perished if not for him. So whether you like him or not, he is venerated around the world. I think he's still considered the most popular leader in British modern history. I'm not sure. David, maybe you'll know more. I think according to the polls. We're not going to talk about him as his life. We're going to talk about him and his relationship to the Jewish community. Now, although he gets a bad rap because of some of the things he said about the Jewish community, he was during his time considered very pro-Jewish, almost to a fault. Now, where is the negativity? Where's this negativity comes? Because he did write in the 1920s about the Jewish international conglomerate that was trying to take over the world, and this conspiracy of Jews, and he actually believed in that, using some anti-Semitic rhetoric from the 19th century. So he was a man who believed there was some sort of Jewish conspiracy group in the world. That is without a doubt true, because obviously he wrote about it. His views may have changed, but he actually wrote, and I have it here, he was using Nesta Webster as example, but he wrote, and I wasn't planning to use him first, so I'm going to get to where I was going to use a biblical character, but he did talk about this conspiracy many times. and even wrote about it in the 20s. I just lost the quote here. Let me see if I can find it. I cannot. All right, so I'll find it later. But what he did as prime minister is nothing less than astonishing. So again, for those of you who don't know, and everybody does, he is the man who in many cases won the war, at least kept England going until we got into it. So here it is. Some people like the Jews and okay, that's a positive one. Let's see here. I can't find the negative one. Anyway, so right away, he was known as a person who was friendly to the Jewish community. In any cases, his enemies often called him the pro-Jewish voice, and we'll talk about them more. But in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he was one of the first leaders to step out and say that this was a menace to the world. He was not in power. He was still in the government, but he was not in power in England. He was the man who stood up and said, it is crazy for Britain to lessen their military as Germany is increasing theirs. He was not worried about the Jews at this point. He was talking about the militarism of the Nazis and how England had a lot of stuff around the world and they were all threatened. He continued this belief, even going to Germany, trying to meet with Hitler. They're in the same hotel. He wasn't able to, but talking to one of Hitler's men, he expressed his confusion at why Hitler was so anti-Semitic and wanted to kill so many Jews. He just didn't understand it. When Baldwin, who he did not like and was very supportive of what was going on in Italy, stepped down, he was actually pretty enthusiastic about Chamberlain at first, but then Chamberlain, of course, continued the appeasement of Mussolini, and David, if you know more, obviously stepped in. Winston Churchill thought he was going to do the same thing with Hitler, which he proved to be right. And he continued to write article after article. It actually became a little bit more popular than he had been. He had a little bit of a lisp. It's a little strange, but he became more and more popular because of this vision and belief that the best way to avoid war was to increase military strength, not to lessen it. So Churchill went to Chamberlain and told him he needed to tell Germany that if they go to war with Czechoslovakia or declare war, that England would declare war against Germany. We all know in history what happened. Chamberlain did the opposite. He made the Munich Agreement, so allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland. How do you pronounce that? Anyway, I can read it, but I always
Sudetenland, I think.
Sudetenland, thank you. And Churchill said this was a major mistake, and basically could lead to the loss of Europe. And as predicted, Germany continued to attack countries, and obviously they declare war, but a little bit too late. And after going to Poland, and once they attack Poland and the war starts, Chamberlain appoints Churchill, reappoints him. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty, and he becomes part of the War Cabinet. He is, at this point, Churchill desperate to become prime minister. He was very, again, usually people who are in this type of position, they want to lead and feel they are the only one who can do it. However, he was not able to negotiate the alliance to do so. And what has been lost by history is he needed one of two people to support him from the other side, Lord Halifax or Chamberlain, to become prime minister. And guess which one he got to support him? In the end, Chamberlain is actually the one who supported Churchill, and that's how he became prime minister. So unfortunately, that little nugget of truth has escaped history, as Chamberlain has been considered throughout. I mean, if anybody's ever heard of Neville Chamberlain, there's only one thing you know about him, unless you're maybe in England, and that is he's the guy who appeased Hitler. That's what how is he looked upon in England, David? Do you know Chamberlain?
Well, it's a pretty there's a general trend toward, lack of historical knowledge on everybody's part now. But to the extent, it's older people, he's viewed as an appeaser, and not in such good terms. But of course now, there's a lot of discussion about whether Churchill is really an evil man because of colonialism and racism and all that.
Right.
So
Yeah, and
it's,
again, this is what we're going to see about all the people we talk about just about. If you look at what he said, he was some way anti-Semitic, a colonialist, diehard colonialist. You can say he was better than most in most areas as a colonialist, but when it comes to what he did for the Jews, he is obviously very important because of World War II. And so obviously through his resolve, and he was pressed over and over and over again to make an alliance with Germany and to basically sue for peace and allow Europe to perish. He did not. If you've ever seen the movie The Darkest Hour, fabulous movie, talks about basically centered on this decision. Is he going to relent and give up and sue for peace on the best terms possible, or is he going to fight? And he, of course, ends up fighting. And because of that, England was able to hold out long enough for America to enter the war. Obviously, he became very popular in England after what happened at Dunkirk. And that, I think, solidified his leadership. England had fallen back to Dunkirk. If you don't know the story, I'm not as knowledgeable as some, obviously. The military was trapped. There was no way to get him off. And so he and others enlisted as many civilian boats to go across the English Channel to pick up these soldiers. So every boat in England went across the channel, picked up one by one these English soldiers, and they were able to get almost all of them across back to England. And that really solidified his leadership in many respects. Now, for the Jewish world, he was, as I said, a believer in this Jewish conspiracy, but he was also a man who had friends with Jews. He believed that the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was not so bad, that it was probably a good thing comparatively, and he thought it was a Jewish Bolshevik. He thought all the Jews, all the leaders were Jews except for Lenin. So he believed that Jews were an amazing group of people, that had survived more than anything, that we had done a lot for the world. He believed that that we deserved our own country, and was an ardent Zionist. He was not prime minister when Ben-Gurion declared a country. He lost the election after the war. He won it years later. So in many ways, he was very supportive of the Jewish causes, but in other ways he wasn't. He did not really do much during the war to save the Jews who were suffering at the camps. There were times where people came to him and pleaded to find ways to allow these Polish Jews to come into England, and he basically ignored all those pleas. Now, from a Jewish perspective, that is a terrible thing. However, we must understand the time period. He was worried about winning a war more than anything else. So was he anti-Jewish because he didn't try and bring these Polish Jews over? Or was he just more concerned with winning the war? That is up to us. When he went to England in 1933 and saw what the Nazis were doing to Jewish businesses, he was visually upset at it. When he became prime minister, Jewish community in Israel was thrilled. So he already had a reputation in Israel. What was it at that time? It was in Israel. And he thought that Jews around the world, not taking out those part of the conspiracy, were really good citizens of their countries. And because of this, he was called to philo-Semitic often by his detractors and those who were running against him. But most importantly, to show what he was thinking when he was a young man in 1904, he was already in Parliament. He fought against a bill that aimed at stopping the immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe to Great Britain, which had increased the Jewish population. And so he was one of the people who helped stop this bill from becoming a law, and more Jews left Eastern Europe. So just as, 3.5 million Jews came to America from 1881 to 1924, he helped that continue into England. And because of that, thousands of Jews probably survived. Any thoughts or questions about him?
Yeah.
Ron?
Yeah. For a long time, I've been getting mixed things about Churchill. Was he or was he not part Jewish?
Well, his detractors, I believe, when they were running against him, inferred that his mother was of Jewish descent. I don't know if that was ever proven. I think that could be true. I think it was more that the liberals in that time period who were running against him, or more appropriate, people in his conservative party who didn't like him, used that as a way to attack him. Is that true? I don't think so. Obviously, it is very well known that that happened, but anybody know if it's actually true? I have heard it is not, but I know that I've also heard that that was used against him politically. Because I think it was very, he comes from an upper class family, and upper class families, I think, at that time period, when he was being raised and when he was a young man, were not connected or supportive of the Jewish world. They might do business with them on the side, but they were not overtly friends with them or overtly supportive, and he was. So even though he had anti-Semitic leanings, this conspiracy, not allowing 1 million Polish Jews to come into England, which may have been a possibility, it may not have been. He is probably the most important person in the Jewish world of the 20th century, I think. Again, would we have won World War II if he had capitulated? If England had capitulated, would America have been able to stop? That is a debate. We certainly could have, but then again, we would not have had a stronghold in England. We would have had to set up our bases in the Atlantic or in America. So it's hard to know. Germany would have still had to beat Russia, so it may not have been possible, but certainly it made it feasible. Any other thoughts? What's really another interesting tidbit for those who are Savanians? Recently, well, we know he was a great painter. Everybody remembers remember everybody seen The Producers?
Yeah.
And the Nazi guy says Hitler was a better painter than Churchill. He could paint 3 coats in one day on a house or something. I forgot the joke. So Churchill was a painter. Often he was always part of Parliament for the most part, but he was not always in power, and he always didn't. So he painted. During World War II, he painted one painting during the entire war. One painting. He did it while he was meeting with Roosevelt in Africa. And I think he gave it to Roosevelt as a present during the moment when they solidified the unity between the two. That painting apparently was lost and then found, and it was actually shown at the Jepson here in Savannah. They did a exhibition on the paintings of Churchill, And one of the paintings was that one painting that was thought to be lost, which was displayed there. Anybody remember who bought the painting, ended up with it? And a guy named Brad Pitt and his wife what's her name? Angelina Jolie. I think they ended up fighting over the payment out of the painting when they got divorced. But what was the most interesting thing, and unfortunately I missed it, because Churchill his mother, I think, is American.
Yeah.
His grandson actually lived outside of Atlanta. And he was the opening speaker for the exhibition. And why was everybody so shocked about his speech? It wasn't about anything he said, but for those of you who love and cherish Churchill's accent, his grandson apparently has a very thick Georgia accent.
Yeah.
And so you went to see Churchill's grandson and he talked like a Southerner. So I think everybody was just enjoyed that the most. I wanted to go that. Huh?
What was the picture of?
I forgot now. I think it was maybe the deserts or something in the deserts. We can look that up online. I saw it. I mean, it was there. I was not there. I wanted to go hear his grandson, but I missed it. But that's what everybody was talking about. So Churchill, again, not intentionally a man who tried to save Jews, but very supportive in many ways compared to his mates of that age. Again, you always look backwards in time. You can talk about what type of person he was in terms of, what England was doing at the time, but there's no doubt that he had an effect on the Jewish world. So let's go to, we'll go back in time. We'll go to most of the people I chose were world leaders.
Do you have a second?
Sure,
I have
please.
I have a note, and there's a personal aspect to it about Margaret Thatcher.
Please. First, explain who she is. Please tell us who she is, because I don't know who she is.
Margaret Thatcher.
I'm just kidding. It was a joke. Sorry.
But Margaret Thatcher obviously served in a different period of time. It wasn't a life and death time as World War II. But she was really viewed as a friend of the Jews. She repeatedly said in various contexts that she admired the Jewish approach to life. She was very close to a lot of people, and one of her principal ministers was Keith Joseph, who was Secretary of Education and Science, I believe. Reported that, and she's obviously from a background, her father, with her father running a grocery store, which, didn't always impress the upper class. It's reported that when she first became prime minister, the Queen asked the Archbishop of Canterbury what he thought of Margaret Thatcher, and the Archbishop of Canterbury responded, "Well, I think she's actually more Hebraic than Christian."
Oh, really?
Yes. But I met her momentarily at a Conservative Party fundraiser in the early 2000s, quite a small group of people. And there was a group of people from the north of London, Orthodox Jews, some of whom started crying when she entered the room. So she was really very, viewed as very supportive.
That's good to know. So, and we can continue if we want. We can either go to other 20th century leaders or stay on the note of England and talk about another person in English history who had a great effect on the Jews. Why don't we do that? We'll stay in England right now, and we'll go to the man himself who personally, in many respects, allowed Jews to move back to England for the first time in hundreds of years. And that was, of course, Oliver Cromwell, which has a direct effect on us. For those of you who know, and we'll talk just basically, Oliver Cromwell was the leader who allowed the Jewish community, although it was always in the works already, but he's the one who allowed Jews to move back to England in 1654, I think, after they had been kicked out in 1290. And why is it connected to our congregation? Because he helped allow the synagogues to establish. And of course, a synagogue in England sponsored our congregation's foundation. This obviously was way after he died, many years before that. But he is the one. So let's talk a little bit of about Jews in England and what Oliver Cromwell did. Jews had lived in England for a very long time, we think, and were in many ways treated better than others at first because the Visigoths, I think it was the Visigoths, who lived there, were as good to them as others, and they weren't as threatened as much. So they lived there for hundreds of years. And then, of course, was it the Visigoths? I'm just getting confused now. Not the Visigoths. Yeah, the Visigoths, who were in before the 10th century, anyway. I am getting confused. One second. Wrong country. Sorry, wrong country. Thinking of it. So let's strike that, reverse it. Let's go. I'm getting confused. We're going to go to England. I was thinking about that. So England, of course, Jews had been living there since the Roman times. They were not an organized community until William the Conqueror arrived in 1066. He was very supportive of Jewish merchants, and Jews did pretty well there for a short time. The problem was obviously that anti-Semitism followed very soon in the next 100 years. And very famously in 1144, we had the very first incident of the blood libel. It was in a place called Norwich, and Jews were reported to have kidnapped a Christian boy, and of course killed him in a terrible way and used his blood for Passover. And that, by the way, is the first time that was, I believe, ever heard, and it is still something that is spread around the world almost 900 years later. So there was never any proof, obviously, but from that time, Jews were then accused of stabbing the wafers that are used in churches, poisoning wells, spreading plague. And then there were more and more accusations of the blood libel. Popes, funny enough, including Innocent IV, had committees to look into this, and they never found anything. But that didn't stop it. And a lot of times popes, although they get a bad rap, were supportive of the Jewish community, try to protect them, as did kings. However, in 1290, Edward I, who wanted money, kicked the Jews out and took all of the lands for himself. He had already been taking money from them by increasing taxes, extorting money from them, preventing them from doing other things. But finally, he just kicked him out, whether it was because he wanted money or because he didn't like them. But he kicked him out in 1290, and it's not till 1654, 55 when they're allowed in. So that's 360 plus years. So am my math right? Yeah, it's 360. So note, which makes it interesting because, of course, during this time, Shakespeare writes his famous play, Merchant of Venice, which is centered on Shylock. And of course, if we've read it, it is an interesting play. Doesn't put us in a good light, but of course, Shakespeare, who did spend a little time in Italy, may have never actually met a Jew. But anyway, Cromwell comes into power, and he's influenced by a man named Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel of Amsterdam. He's gone to Amsterdam. He sees how Amsterdam is leading the world in trade and how they have a very vibrant Jewish community that has been very helpful in many ways. And he was excited about creating kind of the same type of windfall for England to have, for Britain to have this tourism, this trading. And so he wanted to invite the Jewish community back. Obviously, not everybody did, but it was already in the little bit of the works. He made a promise to allow them to come in, to allow Jews from Spain, Holland, and Portugal, all, mostly Sephardic Jews, and wanted to make England one of the most tolerant countries in the world, which he did. Obviously, though, he died very soon afterwards. So he died in 1658. He was somebody who supported the execution of Charles I. After he died, his son wasn't very particularly good. And of course, King Charles II took over, dug up Oliver Cromwell, cut off his head, and put his head on a post in front of the Tower of London, as we know, for 30 years. So you would think that this feud that led to two people being beheaded, of course, one was dead at the time, would have stopped this allowance of Jews to enter England. It did not. So even though Charles came back and did this, Jews continued to be allowed and given more and more opportunities, although they were giving full rights till the 19th century. A lot of people were not supportive of this. Obviously, the Puritans, that those groups were not very supportive. But generally speaking, the Jewish community did pretty well compared to other places, except for maybe Holland. So much so that the Jewish community, the first Jewish community that arrived in America was in England, 1654. The group of Jews in Recife, Brazil. Portugal took back Brazil from the Dutch, and the Jews were kicked out. One boat ended up in New, what was it called at the time? Not New York. Before New York, it was called New Amsterdam. It was in New Amsterdam, and the Jews there wanted to stay. And Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor, said, no, you have to leave. He was, of course, Dutch. One of the Jews there sued to be in the military. Stuyvesant was vehemently anti-Semitic, but only a few years later, England took over that area. It became New York, and it became even more supportive of Jews. So even though the Dutch were famous for being more supportive of Jews, when England took over New York in 1650s, it became more supportive of Jews because England had become very supportive under, of course, Oliver Cromwell. So ironically, England was one of the last countries of these modern European countries in the 19th century to give total freedom to Jews, but they really were given quite a bit from Oliver Cromwell, and a lot of this was continued afterwards. We can go over the details later, obviously, but that's just a little bit about Oliver Cromwell. Any other thoughts or questions? And we can go more detailed on him. It's just hard because there's so much.
Just a comment
Please.
to go back. The painting that Churchill gave Roosevelt is the Tower of Kotubia Mosque, the Tower of the Kotubia Mosque.
All right.
And he painted it in 1943. It was the only thing that he painted during World War II.
Yes, I was right. Yes.
You have a picture of it there, Michael?
No, I don't. Let me click something and see if we can find it. Yeah, here. It's not very good, but if you can see it, you can see it.
I can't believe you're saying that's not a good painting. I think it's an excellent painting.
No, I said it's not a good. It's not a good.
I know, it was a joke.
The painting it's marvelous.
I would love to have that painting in my house, and it would be in my house for about a minute, and then it would be on eBay. Because I am sure it is worth millions. I don't know how anybody want to look. How much did it sell for? I'm sure it's like millions. I guess it was.
Let's see if I have that.
But while we're talking about any questions on Cromwell, Really interesting character. Again, really.
11.5 million.
Yeah.
What year was that? What year did it sell?
No, this is 2021.
So I can say
And
I saw that.
Angelina Jolie sold it.
She must have got it in the divorce.
Yeah, she did. 11.5 million. Brad Pitt gave it to her as part of the divorce. So anyway, nice painting. Even if it's not nice, it's valuable.
So what we learned about Cromwell was he was very religiously tolerant compared to others. He had supporters on this. There were some really famous writers who supported it, but there were some very famous writers who were more puritanical who did not support it and did not want Jewish synagogues and such forth to open. All right, so that is Oliver Cromwell. So we got Cromwell, we've got Churchill, and apparently Thatcher. So we've had a lot of English supporters of the Jewish community. Now, hopefully, how are Jews doing in England today, David? You don't get the best of news out of there, but it's hard.
No, it's not good. I mean, a lot of it's demographics. I think at the height of the Jewish community, there were about 300,000 people here, and there may be only 260,000 Jews, or even slightly less than that. It's a long, discussion about, traditional anti-Semitism, in the synergies with this sort of progressive anti-Semitism, colonialism, capitalism, and so forth. And obviously the Muslim population, it's about 4 million, about 6% of the population. So it's pretty negative. I mean, there are anti-Semitic marches every week, basically. I mean, obviously, pro-Palestinian, pro-Gazan marches every week. So,
could I walk safely?
People,
sorry.
I've been associated with Finchley Reformed Synagogue in the north of London, and even a few years ago, when I and a couple of other people were joining, we were told by the rabbi, "Don't wear indicia of Jewishness when you're wandering around."
So that was exactly my question. Could I walk around with the yarmulke there these days?
It would be risky.
Yeah.
Anywhere in the city, including in the central
How about
city.
Outside of London?
I don't know. There have been fewer incidents, but
okay. Hopefully things will change there. I hoped, God willing. So let's go to the next person. I want to get all negative. Let's get positive. We're going to talk about another person who had a very controversial relationship with the Jewish community, maybe more than anybody else. And that, of course, would be Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, of course. David, I know you're in England, but he's a former president of the United States, just in case you know.
He was an important figure in my youth, as in a negative way.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, again, for many reasons, he is looked upon negatively. I went to his library in California, and they did a good job of it because it's very small, and a whole section is on Watergate. But they did touch on, a lot of people believe if it wasn't for Watergate, he would be considered a great president. But then again,
he looks pretty good in retrospect, I think.
Yeah, and that was the type of person he was. So why am I talking about Nixon? Because obviously, if you listen to the Nixon tapes, what they have available for you there, he did not like Jews. There was a lot of spewing of anti-Semitic rhetoric in his tapes, a lot. He did not like Jews at all. Jews are all over the government. You can't trust those BASTARDS. They turn on you. They're born spies. He had so many of them on his enemies list. And then on the other hand, of course, who was his Secretary of State for a while? Kissinger, who most people who put him together don't realize Kissinger was Jewish. A lot of people just think he was a anti-Semitic alliance, connected to Nixon. But So why is Nixon on this list when he was ardently anti-Semitic?
Well,
Michael, you probably figured it out. Well, he did one thing that was really helpful, saving
well, during the Yom Kippur War, I mean, he and Kissinger were very responsible for arming Israel. I mean, stuff came off ships and planes and were on the battlefield that same day. That was, I mean, Israel was running out of ammunition. It was a much graver situation than we generally think. And
Excellent. Well, let's go over the more details because that's exactly it. On Yom Kippur, on October of 73, Israel is attacked on all sides. They are completely fooled. It was the worst moment in Jewish Israeli history up to that point, up until, of course, what happened in October of last year. It was the last time really Israel was completely fooled until recently. And they were in serious diehard need of food and especially weapons. They were completely caught off their guard. And Nixon, who ironically was anti-Semitic, liked Israelis. He liked Israel.
How does that follow?
He thought they were bold and tough and anti-communists, and he felt like they were just like him, tough, unapologetic, do whatever is needed, and could care less what other people said. And he decided to airlift supplies to him, despite everybody in his cabinet saying, don't do it. We can't risk our relationship with the Arabs and all that oil. Even Kissinger said, don't do it. Kissinger was very smart. He said, don't do it. We have to let Egypt look really good because I think Anwar Sadat wants to make peace with Israel eventually. So Kissinger was even farther ahead of the game than we were. This was not a popular idea in America. He's got Vietnam. I think Watergate's already going on. He's risking a war with the Soviet Union. We know what's going to happen afterwards with the oil embargo that's going to happen later on. All of these things told him don't do it. And he really didn't like the Jews in the first place, but he did like Israel. And so against every single person's advice, he ordered all of those supplies, military and others type of supplies, to be airlifted and shipped in. He also would later become the first U.S. president to visit Israel right before he stepped down as president. So would Israel have lost the war without him? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a military strategist, but it was Israel's worst military moment up until recently. What is also interesting is Flossie's husband.
yes.
Was one of the people who was airlifting and dropping supplies. He was one of the pilots. And apparently he didn't tell her for many, many years. You guys remember Jeff, obviously. He didn't tell her for many, many years, and that he was one of the pilots who did it. He was one of the American pilots. I don't remember if they were ordered. I think they were asked to volunteer for it maybe, and he was one of the ones who did it. So thank you to Richard Nixon for all of the negative things he did with Watergate, and for, again, with like Churchill, it's not what you say, it's what you do. And in both cases, these men did a lot for the Jewish world. So you can look at the rhetoric they said, but you got to also look at the actions. And for whatever reason, and Nixon is hard to understand in an easy moment, but he did. And he could have certainly saved the country of Israel. The other saving grace was the Muslim countries that were attacking were fooled by Israel's negligence. That was another reason Israel was saved. They couldn't believe it was that easy. And so all of these tank units stopped believing that Israel was setting up a trap for them because of what happened in the 67 war, not realizing that Israel was not. And so it was a combination of that, Nixon, little luck, and of course, Israel eventually routed the enemies. And it did lead to, of course, a peace treaty with Egypt, as Kissinger predicted. So that is another one. So again, and it's not only did he send flights, 567 missions in a few days. 567. That is a lot. That's just not, that's an incredible amount. He just basically okayed anything Israel needed. So, so that is Nixon. Whether you like him or not, as a president, as a human being, he did something remarkable for the Jewish community. So while we're still here, we'll stick with the third person. Yes, Michael.
Just a comment. It's because we talk a lot today about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And, it just dawned on me that, Nixon could be an anti-Semite, but a pro-Zionist.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just as Jews can be anti-Zionist. I mean, it's not a very pretty picture when they are, but I think that's a very good analogy.
I think that's a great analogy.
Yeah. So anyway, just thought I'd toss that out.
Well, I think you're 100% right. And it's ironic because also he was anti-Semitic in his rhetoric, but he did have Jews in his cabinet, and there were Jews. I mean, it wasn't like he didn't allow Jews to work for him. There were plenty. You're right. I mean, again, there is some type of discrepancy to some between Israel and Judaism. You have Jews who are marching in these, thank goodness it's a small amount, but you have Jews who are marching in these protests, hopefully not the violent ones, but certainly. So the last one we're going to do is similar, and then we'll do the next three and more next week. And maybe I'll look up some stuff on Margaret Thatcher if you want. So we've talked about it before, but I think you got to put Truman on this list. Truman really gave a major boost to Israel and made sure it was voted in the UN. So let's go over what's happened beforehand. Truman, Truman is president of the United States in 1947 when the UN puts up a resolution for the partition of this area, part of it to go to the Muslims living there, part of it to go to the Jews, based upon the Peel Commission, which we mentioned previously. And Truman was not a big supporter of the Jewish community, Jews. Now, was he anti-Semitic? There had been a lot of Jews through the years who had been going up to him and asking him for stuff. And so when his letters came out in recent years, his notes and his tapes, a lot of anti-Semitism in there, surprisingly to some. But so, what are some things? So let's talk a little about what he said. So the diary came out, said this is, let's see here. They all walk up and down the halls of this place and moan about what they should have done and didn't. What the doctor, okay, I'm missing a lot of stuff. I thought I have the quotes here. Let's see where they are. Oh, they're up there. Sorry. I was starting at the bottom. That's why I couldn't find the quotes. Okay, so Truman is not supportive. In his later documents, he complained about Henry Morgenthau, the former Treasury Secretary who worked for United Jewish Appeal. He complained about all the Jewish leaders who kept coming to him talking about we need to support the Jews moving to Israel. The Jews, I find, are very selfish. They care not how many Estonians, Latvians, Finns, Poles, Yugoslavs, or Greeks get murdered or mistreated. as displaced persons as long as the Jews get special treatment. Yet when they have power, physical, financial, or political, neither Hitler nor Stalin has anything on them for cruelty or mistreatment of the underdog. Put an underdog on top, and it makes no difference whether his name is Russian, Jewish, management, labor, Mormon, Baptist. He goes haywire. So they were really deeply rooted. Plus, he really hated people like Hillel Silver, rabbi who kept talking about Zionism. So he was sick of Zionism. The State Department was vehemently anti-Semitic. They all agreed they would never support a country in Israel for Jews. So what happened? I don't know if you know the famous story. We talked about it, but the famous story is absolutely true. It sounds like it is an urban legend. It is not. One of his really good friends from the years past was a man named Eddie Jacobson, who was an assimilated Jew, not religious at all. And they had been business partners, and they were really, really good friends. And he thought a lot about this guy. Eddie Jacobson was just a Hamish guy, never had ever asked a single favor of Truman throughout his time as president, vice president, or any other thing. And he went over and said, I've never asked for I've never asked for a favor, but there's one favor I'd like to ask. And Truman said, no way. And then, Jacob said, listen, your hero of all time is Andrew Jackson. My hero is a man named Chaim Weizmann, who is still living. I would like you to meet with him. And so Truman agreed to meet with Weizmann, who was very old and sick at the time. So Weizmann, traveled all the way over there to meet with him. And Weizmann convinced Truman to support the UN vote and also to be later the first country to recognize Israel as a country. So not only was this essential, basically it was more than that. The UN vote was going to be so close, nobody predicted, that only, I believe, one vote separated Israel from being established and not being established. He also asked several supporters to convince other countries to support the vote. And that is why Israel was announced as a state in the UN, because of this. And so Truman, even though he was not supportive of the Jewish community, certainly not the leaders, because of this meeting with Weizmann, because of Eddie Jacobson. And it's funny that Eddie Jacobson is now remembered in history, even though, he's just a regular guy. So because of that moment, the U.S. has had a close relationship with Israel since Israel's creation. Now, of course, there's been times when the relationship has been stronger and times when it's been weaker, but it's always been maintained. And that is because of Truman. So Truman was the man who did this. And you can read more about their friendship and Jacobson later and what they weren't obviously, what business were they in? Dry goods.
Haberdasher.
Yeah. All the same thing, one after the other. Cantina. That's what they did. Eddie Jacobson was a Jewish guy. So now this is important because also Truman's Secretary of State at the time was a little known guy named George Marshall, who may have been as powerful as Truman at the time. He is one of the great generals of World War II. He is the man behind the scenes that everybody knows about that helped run the entire war, helped save Europe afterwards by ensuring a third world war would not happen. And he is the Secretary of State to a man who was not elected president, by the way, a man who was somehow in a strange way chosen to be vice president by a very popular president, and that president dies, Truman is not considered a super popular president, even though he did end World War II by dropping the bombs. And his Secretary of State of George Marshall, who was probably viewed by many as even more important and more powerful than the president at the time, I don't know. And George Marshall was very much opposed to this Jewish state, as was the rest of the State Department. It was reportedly the biggest disagreement the two of them ever had. And yet Truman still chose to side with Weizmann and Jacobson against Marshall and against the idea of ruining relationship with oil countries, and yet he did it. So like Nixon, like Churchill, some non-Jewish leanings, but yet when push came to shove, all three of these men were essential, and Oliver Cromwell as well. Any questions or thoughts? So we didn't get to everybody, but next week, and I'll add Margaret Thatcher for next week. But next week, we'll talk about a few more of the non-Jews who've made incredible impacts on the Jewish world. If you have anybody you want me to speak about or anybody you want to bring to it, just let us know. We'll add Margaret Thatcher to it. But again, I'm talking about not somebody who was supportive of Jews. I'm not even talking about the amazing righteous Gentiles who saved individuals and even hundreds and maybe even thousands of people. I'm talking about who had an impact that changed national and international policy, that changed the way the world looks at Jews, that changed the very core of the Jewish world. And so people like Oskar Schindler, who were beyond amazing, and obviously righteous Wallenberg, probably the most famous of them, those wouldn't be on the list. This is for like people who saved entire Jewish communities or changed the way a country or a continent looks at Jews, or helped, create the state of Israel or save the state of Israel. I mean, so you really have to be somebody most likely who's a head of state or somebody really important up there who has a lot of power. All right, so a pleasure, guys.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone has a wonderful week. I hope everyone has a safe time for Memorial Day weekend. And for this weekend, we'll be having regular services, but I think we have, is it this weekend? No, this week we have a Rockin' Shabbat on Friday night, I believe. So if you're coming Friday night, it's going to be a rockin'. And on Saturday, we do have a baby naming. So that'll be pretty cool to have a baby naming. Actually, no, this is not Rockin' Shabbat. I'm completely wrong. It is not Rockin' Shabbat this weekend. My mistake. I'm a little off today, apparently.
It's okay. We forgive you.
That's okay. All right, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. Next week we don't have class. Boy, I'm completely off. We don't have class next week. Just to let you know, I'll send out a note. I apologize.
No class next week?
No class next week.
Okay, good to know now.
And I want everybody to know, despite what Michael thinks, I thought that Churchill was a very good artist.
Okay. Good.